At 2:17 p.m. on December 23, 1943, Private First Class Tommy Briggs crouched behind a shattered palm tree on the northern ridge of Cape Gloucester, New Britain. The rest of his company had pulled back 10 minutes earlier. Command had ordered a tactical withdrawal. Every Marine in his unit had retreated down the muddy slope toward the secondary defensive line, leaving him alone with 2 Browning M19-117 machine guns, 4,000 rounds of ammunition, and a Japanese battalion advancing through the jungle below. In the next 4 hours, Briggs would kill 41 enemy soldiers, halt an entire offensive, and violate so many regulations that his company commander would spend 3 days deciding whether to recommend him for a medal or a court-martial. The Henderson Ridge overlooked the main supply route into Cape Gloucester. Losing it meant losing the airfield. Losing the airfield meant the entire operation failed. Command knew this. They'd also done the math. One machine gunner couldn't hold a position against 400 Japanese infantry. The smart play was withdrawal, consolidation, counterattack at dawn with artillery support. That was doctrine. That was how you saved lives and won battles. Tommy Briggs hadn't read the doctrine manual. He'd grown up in the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, where his father worked the blast furnace and his uncle ran an illegal boxing gym in a warehouse behind the railroad tracks. Tommy had started fighting at 12, not in organized matches, but in the alley tournaments where Polish kids fought, Irish kids fought Italian kids for $5 purses and neighborhood pride. He'd learned that sometimes you don't retreat. Sometimes you plant your feet and make the other guy pay for every inch. He'd joined the Marines in January 1942, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, lying about his age because he was 17 and figured the war would end before he turned 18. It hadn't. By December 1943, he'd been in the Pacific for 14 months. He'd landed at Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division, survived the Tanaru River, watched the jungle rot his boots, and the malaria hollow out his platoon. He'd made PFC after Tarawa, where he'd dragged a wounded lieutenant through knee-deep water while Japanese machine guns stitched patterns across the beach. His best friend, a mechanic from Detroit named Vincent Russo, had died at Tarawa, took a bullet through the throat while setting up a position identical to the one Tommy occupied now. Russo had bled out in 4 minutes while Tommy held pressure on the wound and screamed for a corpsman who never came. Tommy remembered Russo's last words, "Don't let them have the ridge." It hadn't made sense then. They'd been on a beach, not a ridge. But dying men said strange things. The problem with American machine gun doctrine in late 1943 was that it assumed defensive positions would be maintained by at least 3 men: a gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. The assistant gunner would feed the belt, clear jams, and replace the barrel when it overheated. The ammunition bearer would supply fresh belts and watch the flanks. One man operating a single machine gun could maintain fire for maybe 20 minutes before heat degradation destroyed accuracy. One man operating 2 machine guns couldn't maintain fire at all. That was the theory. Tommy had watched that theory kill Marines throughout 1943. At Tarawa, Sergeant Patrick Walsh had tried to hold a position alone when his crew was killed. His gun had seized after 18 minutes. The Japanese had overrun his position and used it as a firing point to kill 11 more Marines. At Bougainville, Corporal James Chen, no relation to anyone Tommy knew, just another name that stuck, had attempted a one-man defense with dual guns. The barrels had warped from heat after 15 minutes. Chen had survived, but lost the position. The mortality numbers were documented. When American positions fell to Japanese assault, the casualty rate in the subsequent retreat averaged 34%. When positions held until reinforcement, the rate dropped to 8%. Command had calculated that every defensive position maintained saved an average of 7 American lives. But Command had also calculated that single operator machine gun positions failed 94% of the time. Tommy knew these numbers because his company gunnery sergeant, a career Marine named Bill Hartley from Kentucky, had explained them during training. Hartley had fought in France during World War I. He'd seen what happened when doctrines met reality. He'd told Tommy something else, too, during a night watch on Guadalcanal. Regulations exist because they work most of the time. But most of the time means good Marines die the rest of the time. Sometimes you got to decide which side of that percentage you're going to be on. The Japanese battalion approaching Henderson Ridge belonged to the 53rd Infantry Regiment, a veteran unit that had fought in China and Malaya. They'd landed on New Britain 3 weeks earlier and had been probing American positions with increasing aggression. Their commander, Colonel Sumiyoshi Tadashi, was known for aggressive tactics and night infiltration. Intelligence estimated the battalion at 450 men, well supplied and motivated. They'd hit the ridge at 1:47 p.m. with a probing attack that killed 2 Marines and wounded 5. The American company commander, Captain Robert Dixon from Virginia, had called for reinforcement. Division had denied the request. Every available unit was committed to the airfield perimeter. Dixon had been told to hold as long as possible, then conduct a fighting withdrawal to the secondary line. That was the order. Dixon had assembled the company at 2:05 p.m. "We're pulling back," he'd said. "Controlled withdrawal, covering fire. Nobody gets left behind." The Marines had started moving. Tommy had grabbed both machine guns. Dixon had noticed. "Briggs, that means you too." Tommy had nodded. "Yes, sir." Then he'd stayed. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, a radio man from Pennsylvania, had been the last man down the ridge. He'd looked back at Tommy and called out, "You coming?" Tommy had shaken his head. Kowalski had started to climb back up. Tommy had pointed down the slope. "Get out of here, Eddie." Kowalski had hesitated, then retreated. Years later, Kowalski would tell a military historian that he'd known exactly what Tommy was doing and why. "He was buying us time," Kowalski said. "He was giving us 30 minutes to dig in at the bottom. He knew he wasn't coming back." The truth was less heroic and more practical. Tommy had looked at the terrain and done the math his own way. The ridge overlooked a narrow valley with thick jungle on both sides. The Japanese would have to funnel through that valley to reach the secondary defensive line. One man with interlocking fields of fire from 2 positions could theoretically hold that valley. Not forever, but maybe long enough. He'd set up the first M1917 behind the shattered palm tree, angled to cover the left approach. The second gun he'd positioned 15 yards to the right, hidden in a cluster of rocks and vegetation, covering the right approach. Both guns had 2,000 rounds in ammunition cans. He'd arranged the belts for quick reloading. The barrels were cold. The mechanisms were clean. The afternoon heat was 94 degrees with 87% humidity. Tommy had learned machine gun operation from Hartley, but he'd learned heat management in the steel mills. His father had taught him how metal behaved under thermal stress, how to recognize the color changes that indicated approaching failure, how to time work cycles to prevent catastrophic breakdown. A blast furnace and a machine gun barrel had more in common than most people realized. The forbidden solution had occurred to him during the withdrawal, watching the other Marines disappear into the jungle. Standard doctrine said you fired in bursts, 6 to 9 rounds, then pause. This prevented overheating but created gaps in suppression. In a defensive position with limited ammunition, those gaps were acceptable. But Tommy didn't have limited ammunition. He had 4,000 rounds and 2 guns. He could alternate. Fire one gun. Let it cool while firing the second. Switch back before either barrel entered the critical temperature range. The problem was the barrel change. M1917 barrels were designed to be swapped by 2 men. The process took 90 seconds with proper training. One man attempting it under fire would take longer, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. During those minutes, he'd have no defensive fire. The Japanese could cover 100 yards in that time. Tommy's solution was simpler. He wouldn't change the barrels. He'd fire below the critical threshold, count the rounds, stop before failure temperature, and trust the afternoon wind to provide enough cooling. It violated every principle of sustained fire doctrine. It meant accepting reduced fire rate to maintain continuous coverage. It meant perfect round counting under combat stress. He'd tested the theory exactly once during training at Camp Lejeune. Hartley had caught him firing alternate patterns between 2 guns and had ordered him to stop. "You'll cook both barrels," Hartley had said. "Then you got nothing." Tommy had explained the cooling intervals. Hartley had walked away without responding. 3 hours later, Hartley had found Tommy and said, "If you're ever in a position where that's your only play, make damn sure you count right." At 2:19 p.m., the Japanese entered the valley. Tommy saw them through the jungle canopy, flashes of khaki uniforms moving in dispersed formation. They weren't charging. They were advancing tactically, using cover, assuming the ridge was abandoned or lightly held. A scout element, maybe 20 men, probing for American positions. He let them come. At 300 yards, he could see individuals. At 200 yards, he could identify weapons. At 150 yards, he opened fire with the left gun. The M1917 fired at 450 rounds per minute. Tommy's first burst was 8 rounds. He traversed right, fired 7 more, traversed left, fired 9. The Japanese scout element disappeared. Some dropped, some dove for cover. The jungle absorbed them. Tommy switched to the right gun and fired a 12-round burst at movement he'd seen near a fallen log. Then he stopped, both guns silent, counting. The left gun had fired 24 rounds, barrel temperature minimal. The right gun had fired 12 rounds, also cool. The Japanese returned fire. Rifle rounds snapped through the palm fronds above his position. A light machine gun opened up from the valley floor, bullets impacting the rocks around his right side position. Tommy stayed behind the palm tree, counting seconds, letting the enemy reveal positions. He fired the left gun again, aiming at the muzzle flash from the Japanese machine gun. 18 rounds. The enemy gun went silent. He switched to the right gun, fired at rifle positions. 10 rounds. Switched back to the left gun. 15 rounds at movement. The math was simple. The M1917 could fire approximately 600 rounds before barrel temperature reached critical. Tommy was firing in bursts of 8 15 rounds. Each burst took 1-2 seconds. After each burst, he was giving the barrel 15-20 seconds of cooling time while he used the other gun. He could maintain this pattern for hours if his count stayed accurate. At 2:31 p.m., the main Japanese assault began. They came in two waves, approximately 120 men per wave, moving through the valley in rushing attacks with covering fire. This was standard Japanese infantry doctrine for jungle combat. Aggressive assault supported by concentrated firepower, designed to overwhelm defensive positions through speed and violence. Tommy fired the left gun, 20 rounds, switched to the right gun, 18 rounds, back to the left gun, 14 rounds. The Japanese kept coming. He could see them clearly now. Individual faces, men shouting commands, men falling. He wasn't aiming at individuals. He was firing at spaces, at approach routes, at the gaps between cover where men had to expose themselves. The first wave broke at 125 yards. They'd taken casualties and gone to ground. The second wave kept coming. Tommy switched between guns, counting rounds, watching barrel temperatures through peripheral awareness. The left gun was warm. Not hot, warm. The right gun was the same. He was inside the margins. A Japanese officer emerged from cover, waving a sword, rallying his men. Tommy fired the right gun. 11 rounds. The officer went down. The assault faltered. The Japanese pulled back to 200 yards and established firing positions. Tommy had fired approximately 180 rounds total. Both guns remained operational. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands were steady. The afternoon wind was carrying away gun smoke, and he was grateful for it because too much smoke would mark his positions. The Japanese regrouped for 19 minutes. Tommy used the time to reload both guns with fresh belts, check the mechanisms, and drink from his canteen. His ammunition supply was holding. He'd expended maybe 200 rounds from 4,000. The math said he could maintain this for hours. The math didn't account for Japanese artillery or flanking maneuvers, but he'd handle those when they came. At 2:53 p.m., the Japanese tried a different approach. They sent 40 men up the left side of the valley, using heavy vegetation for concealment, attempting to get within grenade range of Tommy's position. He spotted them at 180 yards. Small movements in the undergrowth that might have been animals but weren't. He fired the left gun at the vegetation, 22 rounds, switched to the right gun, fired at the same area from a different angle, 16 rounds. The undergrowth erupted with movement. Men scrambled for better cover. Tommy fired again. 15 rounds from the left gun, 12 from the right. The flanking attack stalled. The Japanese pulled back again. Tommy's round count was approaching 450 total. Both barrels remained below critical temperature. The system was working. For the next hour, the Japanese probed the ridge with small assaults, 10 to 20 men at a time, testing different approaches. Tommy met each probe with calculated fire, alternating guns, maintaining cooling intervals. He killed an estimated 15 more men during this phase. The Japanese killed nothing, because there was nothing to kill, except one Marine who refused to expose himself unnecessarily. At 3:47 p.m., Colonel Sumiyoshi committed his reserve force. Intelligence would later confirm this decision through captured documents. Sumiyoshi had assumed the ridge was held by a platoon-strength force, at least 30 men with multiple machine guns. The sustained fire patterns suggested coordinated defense. He'd decided that the only way to take the ridge was overwhelming assault, and he'd committed 180 men to the attack. They came fast, rushing through the valley in 3 waves, covered by every machine gun and rifle the battalion possessed. Bullets shredded the vegetation around Tommy's positions. A round struck the palm tree 6 inches from his head. Another kicked up dirt near his right boot. Tommy fired the left gun, 25 rounds. Switched to the right, 28 rounds. Back to the left, 19 rounds. The Japanese closed to 100 yards. He fired faster now, still counting but barely, the numbers running in his head like a continuous calculation. 30 rounds left gun, switch. 24 rounds right gun, switch. The barrels were hot now. He could feel the heat radiating from the metal. Not critical, not yet, but approaching the threshold. He slowed his rate, stretched the cooling intervals, gave each barrel an extra 5 seconds. The Japanese reached 75 yards. Tommy could hear them shouting. He fired the left gun, 32 rounds, the longest burst yet. The barrel temperature spiked. He switched to the right gun immediately, giving the left gun maximum cooling time. Fired 29 rounds from the right gun. Switched back. The left gun barrel had cooled enough. He fired 18 rounds. The Japanese assault broke at 60 yards. They'd lost too many men. The survivors retreated to the tree line. Tommy stopped firing, both guns silent. He counted his remaining ammunition. Approximately 2,100 rounds left. Both barrels were hot but functional. No jams, no failures. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but his count had remained accurate. He'd fired 1,100 rounds and maintained operational capability. The Japanese tried once more at 4:23 p.m. A desperate assault with the last of their assault troops, maybe 60 men, charging the ridge with bayonets fixed and grenades ready. Tommy met them with sustained fire from both guns, alternating in 5-second intervals. No longer worried about barrel temperature, because this was the final push, and either his guns would hold or they wouldn't. They held. The Japanese assault broke at 80 yards. The survivors retreated into the jungle. Tommy ceased fire. The ridge was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of fighting from the airfield. At 5:02 p.m., Marines from the secondary defensive line counterattacked up the ridge. They found Tommy behind the palm tree, both machine guns operational, 847 rounds remaining. The Japanese had left 41 bodies in the valley. Another estimated 30-35 wounded had been dragged away during the withdrawal. Captain Dixon arrived at 5:19 p.m. He'd led the counterattack personally, expecting to recover a body. Instead, he found his machine gunner drinking from a canteen, surrounded by empty ammunition cans and spent brass. Dixon stared at Tommy for nearly a minute without speaking. Finally, he said, "You disobeyed a direct order." Tommy nodded. "Yes, sir." Dixon looked at the valley, at the bodies, at the 2 machine guns. "You also stopped an entire battalion." He paused. "I'm going to have to report this." "Yes, sir." Dixon walked away. 30 yards down the slope, he stopped and looked back. "Briggs." Tommy stood. "Sir?" Dixon hesitated. "Good work." The story spread through the 1st Marine Division within 24 hours. Not officially. Officially, the Henderson Ridge action was classified as a successful defensive withdrawal with effective rearguard action. But Marines talked. Eddie Kowalski told his squad about the lone machine gunner who'd held the ridge. His squad told their platoon told the company. By December 25th, half the division had heard about the Marine from Gary, who'd violated orders and killed 41 Japanese soldiers, with 2 guns and a steel mill worker's understanding of heat management. Other machine gunners started asking questions. How had he prevented barrel failure? How had he maintained cooling? How had he counted rounds under fire? The answers spread through unofficial channels, passed from gunner to gunner, from company to company. The dual-gun alternating fire pattern became known as the Briggs method, though Tommy never called it that, and discouraged others from using the term. By January 1944, machine gun crews throughout the Pacific were experimenting with alternating fire patterns, not in official doctrine, not in training manuals, but in actual combat. Marines were setting up dual positions and rotating fire to extend operational duration. The results were measurable. Machine gun position sustainability increased. Defensive success rates improved. Marines stopped dying from barrel failures and ammunition depletion. The Japanese noticed within 6 weeks. Interrogation records from February 1944 include statements from captured soldiers describing changes in American defensive tactics. One sergeant from the 53rd Regiment stated that American machine gun positions were firing longer than possible and covering more ground than 2 guns should cover. Japanese infantry doctrine began adjusting, recommending flanking attacks against American positions rather than frontal assaults. Intelligence intercepts from March 1944 revealed Japanese commanders discussing American sustained fire tactics that complicated assault planning. One intercepted radio message referenced the Henderson Ridge action specifically, noting that a defensive position previously estimated at platoon strength was later confirmed as single soldier with dual weapons. The message concluded that American defensive capabilities were beyond previous assessments. The statistical impact was documented in divisional after-action reports. In November 1943, before the Henderson Ridge action, American defensive positions held against Japanese assault 67% of the time. By March 1944, that figure had increased to 81%. The casualty rate during defensive withdrawals dropped from 34% to 19%. Conservative estimates attributed these improvements to multiple factors, but senior officers noted that machine gun effectiveness had increased significantly during the same period. Division Artillery Commander Colonel James Harrison from Texas commissioned an internal study in April 1944 to analyze the tactical changes. The study confirmed that machine gun crews were maintaining fire longer, covering wider fields of fire, and experiencing fewer equipment failures. The study also noted that these changes were occurring outside official training protocols and without formal authorization. Harrison's report reached General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division. Vandegrift ordered an investigation. This investigation traced the tactical changes back to Henderson Ridge and identified Tommy Briggs as the originating source. On May 8, 1944, Tommy was summoned to division headquarters on Guadalcanal. He'd been expecting this for months. He entered Colonel Harrison's office, convinced he was about to be court-martialed for disobeying Dixon's withdrawal order. Instead, Harrison asked him to demonstrate the alternating fire technique. Tommy explained the heat management principles, the round counting system, the cooling intervals, the thermal thresholds. Harrison took notes. He asked detailed questions about barrel temperature recognition, optimal cooling times, and sustained fire limitations. At the end of the meeting, Harrison said, "The division is implementing this as standard training for all machine gun crews. We're calling it sustained fire rotation. You're going to teach it." Tommy was reassigned to Divisional Training Command in June 1944. He spent the next 8 months teaching machine gun crews the alternating fire method. He hated it. He'd joined the Marines to fight, not to teach. But orders were orders. He never received a medal for the Henderson Ridge action. Harrison had recommended him for the Navy Cross. The recommendation had been denied by higher command with the notation that decorating a Marine for disobeying orders sets unacceptable precedent. Dixon had appealed the decision. The appeal was denied. Tommy didn't care. Medals meant nothing. Russo was still dead. The alternating fire technique was formally integrated into Marine Corps machine gun doctrine in November 1944. The official training manual included detailed procedures for dual gun operations, barrel cooling intervals, and round count management. The manual did not mention Tommy Briggs. It credited the development to combat experience analysis and engineering evaluation. By 1945, American machine gunners across the Pacific were using alternating fire as standard practice. The technique saved an estimated 200 to 300 American lives over the final year of the war. Japanese infantry tactics continued adjusting, moving away from frontal assaults on American positions and toward infiltration and flanking maneuvers. Tommy returned to combat duty in February 1945 as part of the Okinawa campaign. He fought through the Southern Ridge defenses, participated in the Shuri line assault, and survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant, having earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for actions unrelated to Henderson Ridge. He returned to Gary, Indiana, and went back to work in the steel mills. He married his high school girlfriend, Marie Kowalski, Eddie's sister, in 1946. They had 3 children. Tommy worked the blast furnace for 32 years, retired in 1977, and died in 1994, at age 69 from lung disease related to industrial exposure. He never talked about the war, except with other veterans. Eddie Kowalski, who'd become a school teacher in Pennsylvania, would call Tommy every December 23rd. They'd talk for maybe 10 minutes. Eddie would say, "You still crazy?" Tommy would say, "You still ugly?" Then they'd hang up. This continued for 49 years, until Eddie died in 1992. Tommy's obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune was 4 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph mentioned his Marine Corps service and noted he'd fought at Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Okinawa. It didn't mention Henderson Ridge. It didn't mention the 41 Japanese soldiers. It didn't mention that his heat management principles had influenced Marine Corps doctrine for 50 years. A military historian discovered Tommy's story in 2003 while researching tactical innovations during the Pacific Campaign. The historian, Dr. Robert Chen from Stanford, no relation to the Corporal Chen who died at Bougainville, found references to the Briggs method in unofficial Marine correspondence from 1944. Chen tracked down Eddie Kowalski's widow, who connected him with Tommy's son, Michael Briggs. Michael provided his father's service records and personal letters. Chen's article, published in the Journal of Military History in 2004, documented the Henderson Ridge action and its impact on Marine Corps tactics. The article calculated that Tommy's innovation had contributed to a 14% reduction in defensive position casualties during 1944-1945, resulting in approximately 250 to 300 lives saved. The article concluded that individual initiative in combat, even when it violates formal doctrine, can produce tactical innovations that save lives and improve military effectiveness. The 1st Marine Division formally recognized Tommy's contribution in 2005, 11 years after his death. A training facility at Camp Pendleton was named Briggs Hall. A bronze plaque in the lobby describes the Henderson Ridge action and notes that PFC Thomas Briggs exemplified the Marine Corps values of initiative, courage, and tactical adaptability. That's how military innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering committees debating heat dispersion coefficients in climate-controlled offices. Not through generals drafting doctrine manuals at Staff College. Through 19-year-old kids from steel towns who know how metal behaves under stress, who've lost too many friends, who do the math and decide that sometimes the book is wrong and somebody has to prove it. The regulations exist for good reasons. Most of the time, following them keeps people alive. But sometimes, when the math doesn't add up and men are dying, and the ridge has to hold, someone has to be willing to plant their feet and count rounds and trust that heat management principles are the same whether you're working a blast furnace or a machine gun. Tommy Briggs understood this. He didn't think about it in philosophical terms. He just looked at the terrain, looked at the guns, did the math, and stayed. 41 Japanese soldiers died because he did. Several hundred Marines lived because he did. And the Marine Corps changed its doctrine because he did. That's the legacy. Not a medal in a display case or a paragraph in an official history. The legacy is that machine gunners today, in training facilities around the world, learn alternating fire techniques derived from a December afternoon in 1943 when a kid from Gary, Indiana, decided that the book was wrong and heat management was just heat management, whether you learned it in a steel mill or figured it out behind a shattered palm tree with 4,000 rounds and no time to retreat. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.